If y'all don't mind standing, my pastor, Mark Crook, I always said God's got a sense of humor, or he wouldn't give my pastor the last name of Crook.
Amen.
So.
That's right. That's right. Praise God. God loves crooks. Amen. Let's pray together, all right? Father God, we love you and we thank you, Lord, for just giving us the freedom to meet tonight. We pray that everything that is done will bring honor to your name. Thank you for all of those who have come out. Thank you for all of those who are concerned and who are raising awareness. And thank you for the unity that's here. We love you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
If y'all stay standing for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, for liberty and justice for all. You may be seated.
We sure do appreciate everybody coming out tonight. This is very inspiring to see the community step up and voice their opinion. A few days ago at the Oil City Park, we had a meeting, and the question kept coming up, is it this too late? And really, I didn't know the answer to that question, and I told everybody, I said, if this is still a free country, it's not too late. And your voice has been heard. You ought to be proud of yourself. The system works, but you've got to stand up. You've got to voice your opinion. And you know, our forefathers left us something real special. But if we're not willing to speak, if we are giving up our freedom of speech, we're already a slave. And I'd like to thank y'all for stepping up. It's inspiring to me. I'd like to thank David Kirby for the facility. Everything you see here is donated. And you give David a round of hand, please. We'd like to thank our representatives because they are powerful people. They could have pushed this through without us. They didn't. Will you give them a hand, because we appreciate them too. And at this point, I'm going to have Clay come up. He has something prepared that Mike Johnson would like for him to read to y'all.
Thanks, Danny. Hello, everyone. My name is Chip Layton, and I'm here on behalf of Congressman Mike Johnson, and he would like to send you the following greetings. Dear friends, as a lifelong opponent of big government, I support you all and your concerns 100%. As you may know, prior to my serving in Congress, I spent nearly 20 years as a constitutional law attorney fighting to preserve our inalienable rights against government abuse and encroachment. All of us understand that individual and private property rights must be vigorously defended if they are to be maintained. And I have dedicated much in my life and career, first in the courts and now in Congress, to do that. As I said from the beginning, if the constituents in the area do not want to support it, I certainly will not support it, and I have pulled my support and have been assured by the original authors that this legislation will now die in this Congress. The past several weeks have presented a wonderful example of how our constitutional republic is supposed to operate, and I have been very encouraged by this community's engagement in the issue. When the founders designed our system of government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, they counted on the fact that citizens would remain informed and engaged in the legislative process. I've been grateful for the ongoing dialogue, and my staff and I have benefited tremendously by hearing and knowing your concerns. There is no question that if more citizens across our nation would follow your example, we would have a much more responsible and efficient government. All of us love and appreciate the beautiful Caddo Lake area, its extraordinary natural resources, its rich cultural history, and its sporting and recreational traditions. Above all that, it is our people that make this area so special. I join you in continuing to look for new opportunities to highlight these features for the rest of our country and to grow and expand our local economy. Thank you for letting your voices be heard. Sincerely, Mike Johnson.
Y'all give him a hand. All right, a couple of things to say. Something that I believe that there's been a misconception that this is just people in Louisiana that are supporting this. If you're from Texas, will you raise your hand? I think you see that. I think you see that this is definitely a bi-state. I want you to know that there's a group of people. Most of them have shirts on just like me that have spent hundreds of hours and to put this meeting together, and they did spend hundreds of hours doing research at no cost to the community. So if you don't mind, I'd like you to give them a hand right quick. The name of our group is Citizens Against the Caddo Lake National Heritage Area. There's no denying what our position is. We wanted to make sure that we weren't pretending to be a neutral group. There are some groups that are pushing this, pretending to be neutral groups, and they're not. And our message from the beginning has been simple: one for all and all for one. Not 1 square inch of our ground do we want in the National Heritage Area. Not one duck blind, not one yo-yo, not one limb line, not one oil well, not nothing. It's already our ground. We don't need to make a deal in it. We don't need to compromise. It's ours. And we appreciate the intent, but we have no interest. We're not, if this comes up again and they change the territory, we're all sticking together. They put my house, my property out, I'm still in. That's what we need to understand. There's a scripture here I'd like to read to you. It's Galatians 5:13. It's one of my favorites. For you were called to be freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love self-serve one another, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I want you to know that's what we tried to do here. We tried to take a controversial subject and love our neighbor as ourselves. Sometimes that's hard, and sometimes emotions get involved. But we, at the group that put this together, want you to know that was our attempt. That's what we tried to do. So, one other thing, I tell you what, if Doyle, if you don't mind, you can grab that bucket and just pass it around. If you'd like to throw a couple of bucks in there to help pay for some of my expenses, great. If not, if you maybe already have, and that's great. You don't feel pressure to, but if you'd like to be part of it, that's fine too. We have a GoFundMe account that I believe is going to be on Facebook, if it's not on there too, to help pay some of these expenses. We're actually filming this. We're filming it, and it should hopefully it'll be good, and I know it will be. The people are doing a good job. We tried not to do it with a camera, with a phone camera. I'm sorry? You'd be glad to stick those in there too. Caddo Parish Alliance. You can make them out to Caddo Parish Alliance. But I believe I've covered it all. Jeannie, you ready? Sure. We're going to have a question. The question and answer is going to be after the presentation. So if you don't mind, we'll wait to then to do the questions. Thank you.
Julie wants to come on up. We're going to have a PowerPoint presentation just to kind of go over a few things, and then we'll move along to our guest speaker.
Hello everyone. Most of y'all know me. If you don't, my name is Julie Bauer. I'd really like to start by y'all giving yourselves a round of applause, because every single one of you has made this happen. You know, when we started this, like Danny said, we started with just a small little group and tried to spread the word because no one knew about it. And we actually got them to drop it out this year. But what I really want to impress upon everyone is that it's not over. It's not at all over. We have been told that next year they'll bring it back with different verbiage, maybe not take as much money from this group or that group or whatever direction, but it may not involve your property. The area may not be as big, but it's going to involve someone's property. And if we're going to stand up and stand together, we need to make sure that So I kind of wanted to give you a background about the history. In '95, the Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, titled the Cypress Valley Watershed Reconnaissance Report, where they actually recommended a Cypress Valley watershed heritage area, which is a lot larger than Caddo Lake. They were pushing an agenda of environmental restoration. They were going to encompass 10 counties and 1 parish, and they were going to make the lines actually all of the 10 county lines and the parish lines. So it would be a huge, much bigger than the 900 square feet that Channel 3 mentioned that it was. Yeah, that's an apartment. That's a 1-bedroom apartment, isn't it? Anyway, what was really alarming is that they already had a community center or a Cypress Valley Center already underway. They had already sent it to a group of architects, which means the plans were there. How long has this really been going on is what the biggest concern is. And then, of course, they recommended the creation of a regional nonprofit to manage the heritage area, which now we have one in Jefferson. This is actually the entire Cypress Valley watershed, and as you can tell, it includes a huge area of both Texas and Louisiana. The Caddo Lake National Heritage Area mainly included Louisiana as far as square footage was concerned. There was really a lot more property in Louisiana because it encompassed Caddo and Bossier Parish across the river. But if this is originally the intent, my concern is this. If you look at the entire proposal that they had in '95, and you look at the fact that there are 10 counties and 1 parish, which now they've moved it over to 2 parishes, Caddo and Bossier. If you were going to try and do it, and you would pick the hardest area to go for first, and that would be the one that encompasses 2 states, 2 Congress. So that's the reason Caddo Lake National Heritage Area, I believe, started first, because then it's really easy every time you turn in your management plan to increase the size of your region. So it's not going to stop, even if they slice it down and say, okay, we're going to take this little corner. Well, eventually, if they can't get their agenda across, then they're going to add more regions, and that's what I really want you to be careful about. So it may not impact you next year, but it might in 2 years, it might in 5 years, and that's what you need to understand. That's why you don't want a single square inch put under a National Heritage Area. To kind of give you an idea about Caddo Lake National Heritage Area, legislation was introduced in 2011 in the Louisiana Senate. The resolution didn't pass, but in Texas, one of the representatives did an interview with the Longview News Journal on August 10th, 2011. And it really bothered me when I dug around and found this information because, number one, it stated that the Caddo Lake National Heritage Area was officially launched the previous Tuesday without the federal legislation in place. So I don't know how it could have been a Caddo Lake National Heritage Area. And you can see yourself, this is verbatim, in quotes, what was in print. It also stated the heritage area was one of the few projects assigned to the U.S. Corps of Engineers for restoration. Assigned. Everything we heard about this heritage area stated that the committees and everybody involved, that it would just be private organizations or a nonprofit organization. But as you can tell, they've already documented as if it already occurred back in 2011. So I don't know if they thought it was going to be a shoo-in back in 2011 when they published this piece, or what. They also stated that 15 years ago was the first meeting to design the project. Well, that makes it, what, 22 years now? So for 22 years, there have been federal agencies, state agencies, all wanting to put your private property in a designation. That's scary. That's a long time not to know about something. So you really need to think about that when, even if next year they bring it up and they've decreased the area, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen to you, and everybody needs to stand up. I just kind of put some data out there for the 2018 Heritage Act. I mean, pretty much I think we've advertised most of this on Facebook and on the webpage, but I sort of wanted to bring it back up. May the 24th was a good day apparently, because May the 24th, it was read to both the House and the Senate, and July the 24th is when they made the press announcement. So, not too bad. It made it as far as the Federal Land Subcommittee. The National Park System is under the federal lands. Everyone needs to be aware of the fact that, no, the legislation that was put out there would not have had any impact as the legislation was written, but there's caveats and hidden nuances in there that you really need to understand. You need to understand the fact that the management plan that is going to authorize every course of action for the National Heritage Area demands that they follow NEPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Heritage Association, number of guidelines it demands that they put into their management plan in order for it to be signed off by the Department of Interior. So no, the legislation said no, they couldn't buy property. They couldn't, not with federal funds. So everything we heard was technically not a lie, other than, I'll go back to the 900 square feet, but they can say that's a misstep. But anyway, technically what they gave us was not a lie. It just wasn't the full truth. And that's what you need to understand, that we need to stick together, we need to stay active, and we need to discover the truth for ourselves. So, and I will close with that. Thank you all very much. Jeannie's going to come back up here.
Technical difficulties. Thank you, Julie. As you guys can all clearly see, there is a lot that has gone on behind the scenes leading up to tonight, and that is why we are here. It is very important for us as a community to understand where this bill came from, how long it has been in motion, and basically the bigger picture. We have to be able to connect these dots, which is why we've dug in and done some research to help you guys out, and we encourage you to do the same for yourselves. We also have a guest speaker this evening who flew in to help us out with that. And I'm going to brag on him a little bit and probably embarrass him, but he is actually one of the nation's leading advocates of individual liberty, free enterprise, private property rights, personal privacy, American sovereignty, and independence. He is a native of Ohio and been a candidate for the Ohio legislature, served as editor of 2 newspapers, and has owned several businesses since the age of 23. In 2006, he was invited to Cambridge University to debate the issue of the United Nations before the Cambridge Union, which is a 200-year-old debating society. Today, he serves as founder and president of the American Policy Center and the editor of the Tom DeWeese Report. He is also the author of 3 books, Now Tell Me I Was Wrong, Erase, and his most recent policy book entitled Sustainable, The War on Free Enterprise, Private Property, and Individuals. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you Mr. Tom DeWeese.
Thank you. I have to tell you, I am so honored to be here with you. I travel the country. I worked with activists all over the country, and I have never encountered such a dedicated group of people who not only know what this issue is, but are so right on with it about what it means, how it affects you, what it's going to do. It's hard for me to stay ahead of you. You guys are right there, and I just applaud you. I have been working on these issues, particularly the heritage area issue, for about 10 years. And we were probably the only organization to testify in Congress against heritage areas. And I was successful in leading a charge in Southern Virginia. They had a heritage area there. It was going to cover 19 counties. That was called the Crooked Road Heritage Area. And that one we got stopped. And that was the first time we were ever able to do that. And what's interesting is that after that, I hadn't heard about heritage areas, any new ones being introduced for a very long time. And all of a sudden, a few weeks ago, Danny contacted me. That exact same week, about 2 days before he contacted me, I was contacted by a lady in Pennsylvania where another heritage area was popping up. And now I've learned there are like 5 that are in the mix right now. You think, what happened? Why all of a sudden have these things started popping up again after we've gone several years without them? Well, I found out that in the omnibus spending bill that was passed back in March, this massive spending bill, they were able to get new funding for these things, for a whole bunch of heritage and historic preservation things. So all of a sudden it's spend a go-go, and here we are, and they're starting to put them in front of us again. Everything Julie said, I agree, and the issue is not going away. It is going to come back. I believe, and it's only speculation on my part, but it's an educated speculation, that the reason that they have pulled back on this now is because of you. They are afraid of you. They can't stand to have the spotlight put on what they're doing. That's why they don't tell you what they're doing. And I believe what is going to happen is that they're listening to what your objections are, and they're going to try to tinker with the language. And they're going to come back and say, oh, we fixed that. And then, of course, if you stand up and say, no, we're not going to support that, they're going to say, you people are just a bunch of troublemakers. Yeah, be troublemakers. Absolutely. Because they never stop, these people. They keep coming. They'll change the words. They'll change the name. But it's always the same. And by the way, what I want to do, obviously I prepared my remarks thinking, to teach you how to fight back and with the thing in place. But I want to give you a complete overview of what heritage areas are, and so you have all the information, all the weapons, all the ammunition that you need so that you know how to continue to fight, because as Julie said, it's coming back. There's no question about that. But I just want to address one little issue before I do that. The local newspaper did an article on Danny and on your efforts, and they very graciously mentioned me as connections with government hate groups from the Southern Poverty Law Center's wisdom. They quoted that. The Southern Poverty Law Center has done 4 separate reports on me. I'm very honored by that. And they deem me a domestic terrorist. And thank you very much. I consider the source from the largest hate group in America. So if they know hate, so they always want to call you what they're doing. I'm in a coalition with 50 different organizations right now that are working to counter the lies of the Southern Poverty Law Center. But when a reporter writes a story like this and puts in that kind of a quote, that's a lazy reporter, probably with their own bias. They're showing who they really are. And, you know, what constitutes a hate group or a government hate person like myself is that I stand for the Constitution, I want limited government, I'm anti-abortion, I'm pro-Christian, I am, pro-private property rights, and I voted for Ron Paul. Now, if that makes me a hater, I gladly accept it. So, let me just get into what I came to tell you about National Heritage Areas so you have this ammunition. You know, what does that term mean to you? I'm getting a picture of what it means to you. But there are many, many government programs that are dealing with historic preservation. There are the Scenic Rivers designation, the American Heritage Rivers Initiative, and then there's the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmarks Program. That just names a few of them. And by the way, National Heritage Areas are not to be confused with the United Nations World Heritage Sites. They're a very different animal. World Heritage Sites, coming out of the United Nations, UNESCO and the United Nations. Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, is a World Heritage Site. The Brooklyn Bridge is a World Heritage Site. Yellowstone National Park is a World Heritage Site. This is an invasion by a foreign quasi-government to have these designations and have control over them. And if you believe, I'll just tell you this very quickly, if you believe that means nothing but an honorary designation, I will tell you that back in the 1990s, I believe it was, Yellowstone National Park, there was a company that wanted to open up a gold mine. It had been closed. It had been there years ago, and they found new technology and stuff. They thought maybe we can get back into some more gold, and they're going to open it. The environmentalists did not want that gold mine open. What do we do? How do we stop this? They went to UNESCO, the United Nations, and they sent representatives over and held a news conference, and they declared Yellowstone National Park was the first World Heritage Site in the world that was endangered. Now, this thing was more than 50 miles away from it, but that's what they declared. They declared that there needed to be a 150-mile buffer zone all the way around Yellowstone National Park to protect it, which of course included the gold mine and a whole lot of homes, towns, roads, all inside there. This is the danger, the buffer zones, what they do with that inside of that. I'm going to talk more about that, but that's the World Heritage Site, just as dangerous as National Heritage Areas. Now, Americans, we love history. Particularly, you know, I'm sure all of you love the history of this nation, you love about our founding fathers, you love what this was all about. We love preserving significant places that played an important role in the making of our unique nation. So when we hear of a plan in our area that's presented as a chance to preserve some of our local heritage, we're interested. And we are even supportive. But in this day of massive government control over so much of our land, over our economy, over our basic ability to live free lives, we've got to be cautious and look at the details of the plan, no matter how innocent or well-meaning that they seem. National Heritage Areas are such a concern. Now, I've been studying these for about a decade, and I have grave reservations. In fact, as I mentioned, my organization is the only one that ever really testified against them in Congress. But let me tell you why. Heritage areas are sold as a means to honor historic or cultural events that took place in a very specific place. We're told that they will preserve our culture and honor the past, that they will preserve battlefields where our forefathers fought and died for freedom, that they will preserve birthplaces, homes, buildings, and hallowed ground for posterity. And we are assured that they will help build tourism and boost local economies. And of course, the question is all that true? Is that what National Heritage are really about? Well, let's take a look. Specifically, what is a National Heritage Area? In truth, my research and my experience shows them to be little more than pork barrel earmarks that endanger private property rights and local government powers. And when I say that, local government powers, what I'm talking about is your local city councilmen, your parish commissioners, these people that you elect for the purpose of deciding how you want to live, how you want your area where you live to be. When these things are put in place, their ability to do that is diminished by higher up federal organizations and by private non-governmental organizations. And let me explain why that's so. Heritage areas have boundaries. You see this? The boundary here. These are very defined boundaries. And they have a very definite consequence for the folks who live inside. If you're going to pass legislation from the federal government and you're going to put federal tax dollars into it, then that is an official government boundary. National historic significance, obviously, is a very arbitrary term. So anyone's property can end up falling under those guidelines. Here are the details as to how a heritage area operates. Specifically, funding and technical assistance for heritage areas is administered through the National Park Service, a federal agency with a long history of hostility towards private property owners. The recipients of these funds in a partnership with the Park Service become a commission or a managing entity, which typically consists of strictly ideological special interest groups acting in partnership with government officials. The managing entity sets up non-elected boards and regional councils to oversee policy inside the heritage areas that stretches over numerous communities and over numerous parishes or counties. In the mix of special interest groups, you're going to find all the usual suspects. Environmental groups, planning groups, historic preservation groups, all with their own private agendas, all working behind the scenes, creating policy. They're hovering over the members of these non-elected boards. Perhaps they've managed to get their own people on those boards, so they're controlling them. And all are collecting the Park Service funds to pressure local governments to install their own private agendas. In many cases, these groups actually form a compact with the Interior Department to determine the guidelines that will make up the land use management plan and the boundaries of the heritage area itself. They sit behind closed doors and decide these things. The management plan is their goal as to how they envision the territory inside the boundary is to be run. The plan will include guidelines for development goals for your community, energy use, there's bike trails, undefined conservation controls, tourism, and so forth. Now, after the boundaries are drawn and after the management plan has been approved by the Park Service, the management entity and its special interest groups are given the federal funds. Typically, this can be $1 million or more, and told to spend the money getting the management plan enacted at the local level. That's their goal. Here's how they operate. They go to local county or parish boards and local city councils and they say, Congress just passed this heritage area and your community, are within those boundaries. We, the management committee, have identified these properties as those we deem significant for preservation. And they may say, we've also identified these businesses that we deem insignificant and potential, maybe they will harm the heritage area. As the managing entity, we don't have the power to make laws, but you as local government do. And here is some federal money for you for that purpose. Now, they go on to say, we will help you create tools, legislation, guidelines, and whatever regulatory procedures you need to make this management plan come into fruition. Incredibly, proponents argue that national heritage areas do not influence local zoning or land use planning. Yet by definition, that is precisely what they do. Found right in the language of most heritage area legislation, the management entity is specifically directed to restore, preserve, and manage anything and everything that is naturally, culturally, historically, and recreationally significant to the heritage area. That sweeping mandate ensures that virtually every square inch of land within the boundaries is subject to the scrutiny of the National Park Service bureaucrats and their managing partners. That is the way that it works. It's done behind the scenes, out of the way of the public input. There are no votes taken by the citizens. Anybody here take a vote on this? Anybody? Doesn't happen. Proponents claim national heritage areas are merely seed grants and that sooner or later they will attain self-sufficiency and no longer need federal funding. And the Park Service has testified several times that they indeed could be considered permanent units of the Park Service because they always need oversight and are dependent on increased funding. In addition, within the heritage areas, the Park Service looks for opportunities to create other Park Service programs. A few years ago, former Deputy Director of the National Park Service, Donald Murphy, testified before the Senate Subcommittee on National Parks that one of the things the Park Service does when administering national heritage areas is survey land that would be suitable for future national parks or national park expansions. Of course, as so many others of these invasive planning schemes, they're everywhere, they're all over us, we are always assured that they are local initiatives. Always. This is what I deal with across the country constantly. Oh, this isn't Agenda 21. This isn't that. This is just local. Always, it's just local. Funny, though, all the money comes from federal tax dollars. And, the process then becomes federally driven by the National Park Service and sometimes by congressmen who use the legislation to hand out cash to the very groups that are pushing these things. Makes them all very happy. But then there's another another driving force behind heritage areas, something that you may have heard of. In 2012, there was a bill called H.R. 4099. It was introduced into Congress to, quote, authorize a national heritage area program. And I love this, it also says, and for other purposes. Wink, wink. The bill described the need for heritage areas this way, quote, certain areas of the United States tell nationally significant stories. They illustrate significant aspects of our heritage, possess an exceptional natural, cultural, scenic, and historic resources, and represent the diversity of our national character. So, name a section of our nation that doesn't contain significant stories. Or locate a place where people from the past didn't walk, live, or carry out their lives. You see, that definition is simply too broad to be practical if the real purpose is to honor our heritage. But the bill goes on to explain, quote, in these areas, the interaction of natural processes, geography, history, cultural traditions, and economic and social forces form distinctive landscapes that should be recognized, conserved, enhanced, and interpreted to improve the quality of life in the region and to provide opportunities for public appreciation, education, enjoyment, and economic stability. I'm sorry, not stability, sustainability. Well, where have we heard these words before? Economic and social forces conserve, improve the quality of life. Well, let's try this quote from 1993. Bill Clinton's President's Council on Sustainable Development. Sustainable development is the process, is the policy of Agenda 21. Agenda 21 was introduced at the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. It was the culmination of a whole bunch of UN meetings. And they brought it all together. This is what they called a comprehensive blueprint for the reorganization of human society, agenda for the 21st century. And its policy was sustainable development. Now, this was not a treaty. It was what was called a soft law policy. That means, in their words, and they're right in saying this, that Agenda 21 was really just a suggestion. However, in 1993, when Bill Clinton was elected president, he issued an executive order to create the President's Council on Sustainable Development. The purpose of the President's Council on Sustainable Development was to take the suggestions of Agenda 21 and sustainable policy and make it American law. On that council were representatives of nearly every single federal agency, EPA, HUD, you name it, Department of Transportation, they were there. Also on that council were representatives of the very environmental organizations that had put it together in the first place. Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society, a whole bunch of them were there. And representatives from corporations. Interestingly enough, the president of Enron Corporation was there. That tells you how good they were with their business. And this is why you see this is sunk in to every aspect of our lives. But listen to this quote. Sustainable communities encourage people to work together to create healthy communities where natural resources are preserved, jobs are available, sprawl is contained, neighborhoods are secure, education is lifelong, transportation and health care are accessible, and all citizens have opportunities to improve the quality of their lives. Now, wait a minute. Are we talking about historic preservation when we're talking about heritage areas? Or are we talking about a massive zoning process involved into central planning? Because that's what sustainable development is, and even the planning groups will admit that. So why is it that the same basic language of sustainable development in legislation is exactly the same as for heritage areas? Could they be from the same top-down agenda? In that light, consider this additional quote from the President's Council. Private land use decisions are often driven by strong economic incentives that result in several ecological and aesthetic consequences. The key to overcoming it is through public policy. Now, what they mean by that is if you suddenly discover a whole, your own gold mine here, you've got your oil wells, you've got all that, that can affect the environment, that can affect the aesthetic value of it. That means new legislation and government programs. And so, what are heritage areas but legislation for new government programs? Did the people of the affected areas ask for it? Anybody here say, golly gee, I think we need a heritage area? Anybody? Is there a dire need? Is there an emergency? Anything we need to have this? And finally, there is this quote from the same policy-making source, the President's Council. Quote, it says, we need a new collaborative decision process that leads to better decisions, more rapid change, and more sensible use of human, natural, and financial resources in achieving our goals. Better decisions by whom? For whom? More sensible use of resources according to whom? This description of government leads away from elected representatives doing the people's bidding. Instead, it establishes non-elected boards, councils, and regional government entities in which local citizens have little or no input. This, of course, is the purpose of the Management Council of the Heritage Area. My friends, the language is the same between sustainable development and heritage areas because they are both part of the same collaborative process. As proponents talk about historic preservation and heritage inside the heritage area, you will also find the catchwords resource conservation and resource stewardship, for example. It's all about control. Control of the land, control of resources, control of decision making. And how does that fit in with the claim of preserving the American culture, which was built on the ideas of free enterprise and private property? The fact is, it does not. In reality, national heritage areas consist of land targeted by the National Park Service for future national parks and land acquisition. The Rivers of Steel Heritage Area in Pennsylvania has existed almost exclusively as a National Park Service lobbying operation, outwardly campaigning for federal land acquisition authority and national park status. Proponents of national heritage areas also claim that they are all, as I said before, locally driven projects. Nothing could be further from the truth. Landowners within the boundaries of the proposed heritage area are left in the dark through the entire process. You already know that. Here at the Caddo Lakes Heritage Area, you were to be shown the official map of the boundary. You weren't to be shown that until the actual legislation passed. You were not to know. We have several maps. See this over here, several different ones. Every time you look, it's a different map. Who's in it and who's not? You were not to be shown that until after it was finally passed. Does that concern you? Does that sound like Nancy Pelosi saying, when we pass Obamacare, we got to pass it so we know what's in it? Each and every heritage area bill refuses to include simple written notification to property owners that their land will be inside the boundaries of the heritage area. Seemingly, the Park Service and their management partners are not too eager to share all of the good news with all the local citizenry. Here's this wonderful thing they're doing, but we're not going to tell you about it. I've personally been in meetings with congressional staffers to discuss heritage areas, specifically the staff of former Virginia Congressman Frank Wolf, who was at the time the major proponent of heritage areas. I asked them if they intended to notify affected landowners living inside the boundaries of the specific heritage area. They looked at me like I had two heads. They shuffled their feet, and they kind of looked at each other, and they looked down at the table, and then they said, but there's no way to do that. It would be too costly. How could we reach everyone? Well, I then suggested that they might want to research a little-known federal agency called the U.S. Postal Service. Apparently, employees there, we call them mailmen, appear to deliver to each and every one of the homes in the designated area every day. What a miracle! The fact is, they don't want to tell you in advance because you might object, and that would disrupt the process. No matter how noble a project may sound, alarm bells should go off when proponents want to enforce their vision in secret. If these national heritage areas were truly driven by local enthusiasm, we wouldn't even be here today. Local enthusiasm would have attracted and generated local funding to create a local heritage area. Instead, national heritage areas depend on federal tax dollars because they lack local interest. And not a single heritage area has ever succeeded in attracting that interest throughout their entire infinite lives. None of them have ever attracted that kind of support. The federal money is the villain. If you just want to honor an area for the historic or cultural achievements that happened there, a simple resolution from Congress and a plaque at the county line could do that. I met with a congressman. We were fighting the one I happened to be stuck living in, the Journey Through Hallowed Ground heritage area, which goes from Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, to Gettysburg Battlefield. And a congressman from Maryland, a good guy, his name is Roscoe Bartlett. He's not there anymore, but he was. And he was co-sponsoring this thing. And I went to him and I said, Congressman, why are you doing this? And he said, well, I think that we're helping the communities to honor what happened there and help the Chamber of Commerce promote tourism and so forth. And I said to him, Congressman, couldn't you achieve the same thing by simply having a resolution passed in Congress that they could, then the Chamber of Commerce could use that? Hey, look, the Congress recognized us, and have some plaques and so forth. What do you need the budgets for? And he looked at me, and by golly, Congressman Roscoe Bartlett introduced that exact bill to do that. Heritage area with no budget. It was immediately smashed in Congress because it's not about that. It's about the money and the power. There are 49 national heritage areas across the country so far, with more that are now being considered. Caddo Lake, if legislated, as you know, will affect 900 square miles of private property, businesses, and whole communities. That is a massive area to cover. Let me tell you what I know about a few of the existing heritage areas and paint a picture of what you might expect from the proposed Caddo Lake. Here's just a few tidbits. The entire city of Baltimore, Maryland, is a national heritage area. The entire state of Tennessee is covered by the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area. In Waterloo, Iowa, which is a major part of the nation's breadbasket and home of the John Deere Tractor Company, Silos and Smokestacks Heritage Area was sold as a means to honor the farmers. Since its creation, not much has changed for the farmers who live inside that heritage area. There has been no focus by its leaders to actually help farmers by keeping taxes down or helping them to compete overseas against competitors. Instead, they are essentially putting American farmland in a museum. But Waterloo slumlords who own dilapidated buildings and empty storefronts in the downtown area did receive massive taxpayer funding to fix up their buildings, and they got to raise their rents. Grants flow like water to special interests in the name of historic preservation. There are educational programs paid for by taxpayers in the Silos and Smokestacks Heritage Area. They have these wonderful education programs that they teach things such as why manure is important to farm life. Along the Mississippi River, there are two heritage areas, Mississippi Delta and the Mississippi Gulf Coast National Heritage Area. Now here's a region rich in history. There must be all kinds of good things happening along the mother of all rivers. Well, today, you won't find people participating in one of the grand historic traditions of the river, living on river boats. There, where once whole generations of river people living on such boats. Now you talk about American heritage, that's right out of Mark Twain. But back in the 1990s, as part of Bill Clinton's American Heritage Rivers Initiative, watch out for that one, those living on houseboats were moved off the river. Certain other boat traffic and river activities were also curtailed. It was all in the name of environmental protection, of course. In addition, the traditional floodplain designations were moved back to an extreme distance. What they did was they looked to see how far in history had the Mississippi River flooded. Even though it may not have happened for 1,000 years, that distance now became the floodplain. Inside there now were homes. Now they can't get flood insurance. Now they can't live there. And what's the result? Eventually the houses come down and they environmentally have pushed back. And they put the Mississippi River in a museum. So the heritage areas were used to honor what? Certainly not life on the river. In West Virginia, we find the National Coal Heritage Area, introduced in 1996 by former Congressman Ray Hall. It was sold as a way to honor the coal industry. Apparently, Ray Hall thought that since the miners had all lost their jobs due to environmental regulations on the industry, perhaps they could make up for that by throwing them a few extra bucks. They could go out and give tours of their now bankrupt area and their closed mines. I will make this challenge. Just try to mine a single lump of coal inside the National Coal Heritage Area. Not on your life. Restricted, taboo. In short, they put West Virginia coal in a museum. You get the picture? As I said, these are examples or just tidbits of information that I've picked up over the years as we've watched the spread and the development of national heritage areas. But now let me tell you about one that I know personally because I live in it. Not only that, I led the fight to stop it and succeeded for more than 3 years before we were betrayed by 2 Republican members of Congress. As I mentioned it earlier, it's called the Journey Through Hallowed Ground Heritage Area. Much of what I'm about to tell you is taken directly from congressional testimony that My American Policy Center presented. The Journey Through Hallowed Ground Heritage Area created a 170-mile-long federal corridor encompassing portions of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Of course, it was sold as a means to honor and protect some of the most precious historic areas of the nation, including, as I mentioned, Thomas Jefferson's home and Gettysburg battlefield. There are also something like 5 or 6 presidential birthplaces in there. Chief sponsors, again, was former Virginia Republican Congressman Frank Wolf, who promoted it as saying, the Journey Through Hallowed Ground corridor holds more American history than any other region in the nation, and its recognition as a national heritage area will elevate its national prominence as deserved. He also claimed that it was an effort to create economic opportunity by celebrating the unique place in American history the region holds. Economic opportunity. The legislation assigned the usual management entity consisting of the Journey Through Hallowed Ground Partnership. This was an umbrella group of preservation activists and lobbyists which helped power the legislation through Congress. Then, of course, stood to directly benefit from the power gained and all the money going into their pockets. Also, strongly pushing for passage was the Department of Interior, which saw the heritage area as a means to oversee and restrict development and land use in the area. One example of a group that pushed hard to establish the Journey Through Hallowed Ground was the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Another was Scenic America. Both of these national groups have very benign titles, but very serious missions. But are they interested in just historic preservation or massive top-down controlled land use restrictions? Well, here's some insight to answer that question. You might have heard of Measure 37 that in Oregon that passed in 2004. There was a basic property rights initiative that wasn't very hard to support, no matter what your position was on property rights. All it did was reaffirm the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. It simply said that when state or local governments pass laws that take away somebody's property rights and devalue their property, those states and local governments have to compensate that person, or if they can't compensate that person, they have to waive the regulation. Simple as that. If it passed overwhelmingly in Oregon, despite a massive campaign by environmentalists to try and prevent its passage. And it was even upheld by the Oregon Supreme Court. Groups like the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Scenic America fought with everything they had to defeat this initiative. It had nothing to do with historic preservation per se, but obviously these groups support a much bigger agenda. They knew what they were up against. So beware. When heritage areas come to your region, you are inviting these groups to oversee your land use decisions. So as I said, proponents often claim that these are all just honorary designations. They are designed to enhance tourism, but the bills that they actually create have very little to do with driving tourism to the region. Tourism is typically a result of good advertising. The bills, have very little. These bills have very little to do with advertising, but they have a lot to do with giving these groups power to influence land use decisions. And here's a bottom line. There is no measurable increase in tourism in the boundaries of the Journey Through Hallowed Ground Heritage Area. It has nothing to do with that. But when property owners express concerns that their property could be taken in the process, as you have, they have a ready-made answer. Don't worry, they say. They quickly point to language in the Heritage Area Bill that assures property rights protections. The language, again, was written by former Congressman Wolf, and it is the legislation. It's in the Caddo Lake Heritage Area. It says this, quote, "Nothing in this subtitle abridges the right of any property owner, including the right to refrain from participating in any plan, project, program, or activity conducted within the National Heritage Area. In other words, it is written to assure us all that you have the right to opt out of the National Heritage Area, so there is absolutely no threat to your private property." Wow. How many want to opt out? Raise your hands. Now, wouldn't you love to have them sitting here so you could ask them, how do we do that? This is an official government boundary. Name the program anywhere inside official government boundaries where a property owner could say, I don't want to play. I don't want to pay my property taxes. I don't want to have to get a permit to fix my porch. I don't want to play. Just try that, and after they stop laughing, let me know. So, as we work to oppose heritage areas, we asked proponents of Congress if they had asked property rights experts to look over the legislation to find any dangers. We said, have you put these bills before experts, specifically public interest property rights attorneys? And one of the answers I received from Congressman Wolf's office was, no, and we don't plan to. And he said it just about like that. Well, we did. We asked several experts, and let me tell you what they had to say. Specifically, this was about the Journey Through Hallowed Ground Heritage Area, but these are all boilerplate programs, so it applies to all of them. James Burling, who is a principal property rights attorney for the Pacific Legal Foundation, had this to say, quote, "This bill suggests that Congress still doesn't get it. The so-called protections for private property are largely symbolic, so long as regulators can browbeat landowners into becoming willing sellers." After they've beaten you to a pulp and you say, okay, I'm leaving. Oh, we got a willing seller. We will continue to see the erosion of fee simple property ownership in rural America. With the influx of federal funding, the regulatory pressure on landowners to sell will, in many cases, be insurmountable. The legacy we will leave to future generations will not be the preservation of our history, but of the preservation of a facade masquerading as our history, subverted by the erosion of the rights that animated our history for the first 200 years of this republic. Joe Waldo, who is a president of a property rights law firm, Waldo and Lyle, said this, The bill before Congress has nothing to do with a heritage trail, but will result in a trail of tears for those least able to stand up for their property rights. This is no more than an effort to overreach by the federal government with regulations that will restrict homeowners, farmers, and small business people in the use of their property. And Roger Pilon of the Caddo Institute said, quote, "There is nothing wrong with historic preservation. In fact, it's commendable. But it has got to be done the right way. Indeed, it is not a little ironic to simply take those historic rights in the name of historic preservation." And it goes on. More and more have said the same thing. Clearly, national heritage areas are nothing less than federal land use policy. That means control. In 2000, Congress designated the Yuma Crossing National Heritage Area in Arizona. Less than 10 years later, and this is very pertinent to you, less than 10 years later, citizens began to realize how the heritage area was being used through local government regulations to restrict their property rights. They actually were able to get a bill introduced into Congress, but it was never passed, to try to restrict and redesign the boundaries of the heritage area to ease the pain of the property owners that they're still suffering from it in Yuma. Accompanying that bill was a report that was submitted by the then chairman of the House Resources Committee, Richard Pombo. His report explained the situation in Yuma. His report says this, quote, "When the Yuma Crossing Heritage Area was authorized in 2000, the public in Yuma County did not understand the scope of the project and was surprised by the size of the designation. Concerns were raised by citizens about the size of the designation and the potential for additional federal oversight. The fear of adverse impacts on private property rights were realized when local government agencies began to use the immense heritage area boundary to determine zoning restrictions." That's how they work. The reason the citizens of Yuma were surprised is because citizens didn't find out about the heritage area designations until they actually happened. Just allowing for notifications would be a way to make this a lot fairer, more open and honest in the process. But proponents fight that tooth and nail. Obviously, they would rather spring it on you unsuspectingly than tell you about it in the first place. True property rights ownership lies in one's ability to use your property as you wish. Zoning and land use policies are local decisions that have traditionally been the purview of locally elected government who are directly accountable to the citizens that they represent. But national heritage areas corrupt this inherently local process by adding federal dollars, federal mandates, and federal oversight to the mix. And along with that is an army of special interest carpetbaggers who call themselves stakeholders. Look at the documents. How many times have you read the word in there, stakeholders? Over and over again, stakeholders. You know what? You're the stakeholders. You're the ones who have to live there under what's being done. These guys swoop in, grab their federal money, put the regulations on, and head on to the next one. They're carpetbaggers. It must be understood. The heritage area affects all the land in the designated area inside those boundaries, not just recognized historic sites. The federal designations made from congressional legislation creating federal regulations and oversight through the National Park Service require a form of contract between state and local governments and their entities and the Secretary of the Interior. That contract is to manage the land use of the region for preservation. That means federal control and zoning. either directly under the terms of the Management Pact or indirectly, and that's the word you've got to be careful of, indirectly. Such indirect control is the real danger. In spite of the specific language in the bill which states property rights will be protected, the true damage to homeowners may well come from the private groups, the non-governmental organizations, those NGOs, and preservation agencies which receive the public funds. The experience with at least 49 such heritage areas now in existence nationwide clearly shows such groups will convert this money into political activism to encourage local communities and county governments to pass and enforce strict zoning laws. Heritage area proponents like to hold up a report from the Government Accounting Office that says national heritage areas do not appear to have affected private property rights. And this is why that report is meaningless. While the tactic makes it appear that home rule is fully in force, removing blame from the federal designation, the impact of of everything that's being done there is fully the fault of the heritage area designation. The result being private property ownership rights are diminished and much of the local land use brought to a standstill. In their own words, proponents say right here in their feasibility study in the Caddo Lake Heritage Area, it says, quote, to identify and evaluate alternatives for managing, preserving, and interpreting national important cultural and historic landscapes, sites, and structures existing under and around Caddo Lake. That leads to an awful lot of government control you've never experienced before. And they clearly describe who is going to be in charge. They seek wide support from governments, industry, private, nonprofit organizations, and in addition to local residents. What about this promised tourism? Well, as I said, it just doesn't happen. What happens is certain industries might find out that they are not fit they don't fit into that vision of the environmental special interests. Eventually, some existing industrial operations may find themselves regulated or taxed to a point that they either have to leave or go out of business. Property that is locked away for preservation is no longer productive and no longer provides the community with tax dollars. Some roads most assuredly will be closed to protect the integrity of the historic area. That means land is locked away from public or private development, diminishing growth for the community. It also means hunting and recreational use for the land will most likely be curtailed. Should I say that again? Hunting and recreation use is most likely to be curtailed. Eventually, with such restrictions, will take away the community's economic base. Communities with sagging economies become run down and uninviting. Preservation, zoning, and lack of jobs force ordinary people to move away. Experience has shown tourism rarely materializes. These are the reasons why the specific language in the heritage area legislation designed to protect private property rights is basically meaningless to the actual outcome. While the land may not be specifically locked away in the name of the heritage area, its very existence creates the pressure on local government to act. The result is the same. The fact is the heritage area designations are completely unnecessary. Most of the historic sites are already under the control of the Park Service. Most presidential birthplaces and significant historic sites are already well preserved. Every step of land in America had something from the past occur on it. Proponents of heritage areas are using our great love of our history as an emotional sledgehammer to impose a massive federal pork barrel scheme that enriches the pockets of private advocacy groups by helping to impose draconian controls over the dreams of average American homeowners. In short, the greatest threat from the heritage area is that it creates a pipeline of federal money. and consequently political power to those national organizations to promote their specific agendas over your community and its development. The Caddo Lake Heritage Area that was proposed includes all of this. It is it's massive in size. It is being pushed by the same special interest groups, and unfortunately, it was supported by Senator Bill Cassidy and Congressman Louis Gorment, because I believe, to be friendly to them, I believe that the assurances of property rights protections that we now know are meaningless, they believe that. Proponents refused to notify those living inside the boundaries, and above all, there is simply no reason for it. You already have a tourist industry set up. You already have lots of environmental protections on the lake. The heritage area only serves to create another layer of bureaucracy and massive grant money. But if you own property on the shoreline, you likely will see you lose your control over that land. It'll be pushed back. If you have a private dock or a boat landing, you will likely lose it. You will find, for example, that bird habitat may now take precedent over your use of your land. That's how it works. Little by little, the restrictions set in. Little bit, little bit, little bit. You have done the right thing. You stood up. You have fought. You have put your line in the sand. They're afraid of you, and that's why they've backed off. But understand this. They're not done. They intend to come back again and again, because it has nothing whatsoever to do with historic preservation. It has everything to do with control. Step by step, they are destroying rural America. They are destroying your ability to live there. They want to move you into the cities and get you out of the way of here. Rural people are independent people. Rural people are people who stand up for their rights. You radicals, you. Stay vigilant. Do not back down. Watch every single step they make. And every single time they raise their head, whack it down. Absolutely. Clive Bundy's a friend of mine. Stay vigilant. Fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. DeWeese. It's a lot of information there. I would like to say there's also a table for some of you who didn't make it to the gymnasium beforehand, where Mr. DeWeese has brought some of his own information to share with you guys, as well as books and different merchandise, and you're welcome to stop by afterward. I know you guys have been showered with a lot of information this evening. I remember when we began as a group, we started investigating this bill and everything that it seems to be connected to. We were mind blown repeatedly. Raise your hand if you can relate to that right now. It's a rabbit hole that we found ourselves in and suffered from what I like to affectionately call mushy brain. It's a lot to take in, and it almost always leads to more and more questions. So tonight we made sure to set aside a little bit of time to answer some of your questions, those of you who took the time to come out here tonight. First, I would like to share a few of the questions that we have been asked recently. The first ones, the main one we're getting from people right now is, what's the next step? The bill was pulled a few days before this, so we kind of have to go in a different direction right now. Number one, we have to stay on top of what is going on in our legislatures and Congress. We have to stay engaged. We are a very small group of people, this group that put this together tonight, and we can't do it for you. We need you to help us. So we just ask that you stay engaged in this fight or to stand with us. We have also been asked if the bill is gone for good. I think you guys can tell tonight it's not. We were told by a representative in Mr. Ratcliffe's office on the same day that the bill was pulled that they will tweak the bill and they will reintroduce it next session. They're not shy about it. We have not won the battle yet. We also discovered a few things during our research that we wanted to make sure were shared tonight. We've heard in media recently, the entire state of Tennessee is in fact an NHA. Nothing to be worried about. But what they don't tell you is 67,000 acres of land has now been declared unsuitable for mining because, and I quote, mining is incompatible with the state use land plans and would harm the historic lands. In the Shenandoah Valley NHA, cattlemen now have to provide livestock-free zones in order to keep their livestock from getting into the rivers, the lakes, and the streams, because the management plan there believes that they should not be allowed to contaminate the water. Now, no livestock can use those waterways as a source for drinking water in that National Heritage Area. We have also been told by Senator Cassidy that people here in the oil business should not be concerned about their jobs because Haynesville Shale has no problem and the Cane River National Heritage Area is there. So we looked into the Haynesville Shale locations in relation to the Cane River National Heritage Area, and we found that there is no Haynesville Shale production being done within the boundaries. In 2006, Louis Gohmert voted against a bill that would have created 10 NHAs. We are curious now as to what changed. See, we have a few questions ourselves, but we've also found several answers that we'd love to share with you if you guys would like to line up here. And we can start a question and answer session. Now, y'all don't be shy now. Does anyone can we bring the microphone to the middle right here? If we could just form a single file line. Now, before we begin, I would like to say, let me get my thoughts together, y'all. There are a lot of them. We have a few rules this evening because we want to be as efficient as possible. So I ask you to please respect them and don't make me be the bad guy. We're going to create a single file line right here at the front. I ask that you take about 30 seconds to ask your question because we want to accommodate as many people as we can. We also ask that you do not share commentary, only questions. We all have comments, but tonight at the microphone, we would really like to focus on questions only because being an informed people is our greatest asset. I would also like to point out that your questions will be answered by our Caddo Lakes Last Stand research panel and or Mr. DeWeese. We cannot take questions directed at anyone else tonight. Once your question has been answered, we ask that you step away from the microphone to allow for the next person in line. And if we can all agree to those rules, then we can begin. All right, let's get you turned on.
Hello?
There we go.
Are we good?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
The question that I have is for Mr. Johnson's representative, who was here earlier, and he gave his statement saying, there he is. He said that Mr. Johnson was for everything that we stand for, but his name is on this bill. And I just want to know what made him change his mind.
I appreciate your question. Like I said in the beginning, we can only take questions directed at our panel or Mr. DeWeese.
I understand.
I'm not sure that they're prepared to answer questions this evening. Are you willing to speak with him?
Please, say it on the microphone so we can all hear. Because Mr. Johnson said he was for it, and now he's against it. So let's hear what.
Can y'all hear me? Yeah.
Thank you, sir. That's a good question. I think that on paper it looked good originally. But then when Congressman Johnson started digging, and everyone here knows his record on constitutionalism and limited government, he had conversations with Danny. Mr. DeWeese wrote that article sometime back, and people read it. Staff did research and got it to him. And he realized everything that they say is true and that it's a bad bill, and he pulled his support.
I will say something for Mr. Johnson, too. Congressman Johnson, he was one of the first ones that contacted us, was on the phone with us for an hour. I did respect the way he treated us through this whole situation.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for coming to answer that question. All right.
Patrick Harrington, I'm an attorney here in Louisiana. So my question is for Mr. DeWeese. And yeah, I mean, first, quick commentary just to say thank you for the most comprehensive, layout overview of heritage areas. of the 49 current heritage areas in the country, do you know of any successful, noteworthy lawsuits or legal action that's been taken in terms of fighting this in the, I guess, reactive phase instead of proactively going through the legislative branch?
I'm glad you asked that question. By the way, I apologize for all the details that I poured on your head, but I thought you needed those things. When we testified in Congress against the Heritage Bill, the chairman of the Senate committee said, well, has anyone filed a lawsuit against any of this? And our response was, that's the way we're supposed to come up with good policy, whether anybody filed a suit against it or not. To my knowledge, no. But the real problem we have with it is that we have our whole movement, the weakness we have is having enough lawyers. There's so many times we have people who need a lawyer, we don't have one, and it would make a huge impact. But to my knowledge, no, we haven't had lawsuits filed on that. Yeah.
Are you volunteering, Mr. Harrington? No.
Right? Yeah. That was my next question.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I'm Latricia Kennedy from Atlanta, Texas. I had one question when you announced how many acreage this would cover. 900 and what was
900 square miles, isn't it?
I mean square miles,
Yeah.
not acres.
Yeah.
My question is there mitigation involved in this? Because if there is, we're not talking about 950 miles. We could be talking many more miles than that.
One of the real problems that we have found with all of these programs are buffer zones. You know, if you live next door to a national park, then they start talking about a buffer zone. They've used these throughout all kinds of programs, and they'll say, oh, here is the core of what we're talking about, but we put this buffer zone around it. The purpose of the buffer zone is to begin to eliminate human activity inside there, and then when they finally achieve that, then they expand the core to the boundaries of the buffer zone and put another one there. It's like a cancer cell. It just keeps growing. Understand this. This is about control. If you would take, now we got 49 heritage areas. If you could take the map of the country and begin to lay them all down, you can begin to see the pattern. Eventually, if they keep, we have several more now that they have want to put in place, and originally we were talking about 100. Eventually, what we're talking about is every single step of land in America in a heritage area. This gives them the mechanism to then begin to do more and more land use control. So the buffer zones are the real danger. That's the cancer cell that grows it.
Hi, I'm Nick Wolf, the pastor at the Vivian Methodist Church, and my question is specifically with this one for this area. From my understanding, Oil City and Vivian, we get our water from Caddo Lake. Would this heritage area affect municipalities' ability to draw from that lake, and would the actual legislation affect that, or would that come from the pressure from like the Sierra Group or whatever NGOs would come in and do that?
We've done some research on that. We think it would be political suicide if they tried to restrict our water use. What I think the plan is once they kill the economy in this rural area, we won't need the water anymore. So I think indirectly, the environmentalists think us getting one drop of water out of Caddo Lake is bad. So, but we don't think there's any way that they can keep us from getting water out of Caddo Lake for our towns just for.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Go ahead, ma'am.
I'm Terry Cedric, a resident of Vivian. My question is, even though the bill hasn't passed, is there any way to stop the government from coming in and declaring eminent domain?
Very good question. Yes, no, there is no way to prevent that. And we've been talking about this today as they have pulled back the bill. They have, as Julie demonstrated, was it 22 years been working on this thing? They aren't going away, and they got lots of ammunition and lots of plans in their pockets that they can use. So it can come back from any way. It may not be a heritage area, and they may not have the whole thing, but they'll start over here, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. So that's what you have to be aware of. It's a very good question because that's exactly what they'll do. Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Diane Long. I am a citizen of Shreveport, Louisiana, and I am a oil and gas landman. And I know how hard it is already to get a lease, and I have to deal with so many different entities. What do you think will eventually happen to the right of mineral ownership in those areas?
I don't know if we actually have the answer to that question, to be honest with you. I think one concern in the oil and gas should be concerned about is when they went into the hills of Bossier Parish, we knew they weren't interested in this Caddo Lake. We think they were interested in Caddo Indians, and we don't know what effect that may have on oil and gas drilling from, when this becomes federally controlled land, what that'll do for us making a location will be. We think that's a serious issue for the oil and gas. And we called the state and we asked them these questions, and their answer was they wouldn't know the answer to those questions until after the legislation was passed.
Yeah, like Nancy Pelosi. I understand. And by the way, Mr. DeWeese, real quick, I have been listening to you for years. And if some of these people had come to our meetings back in 2007, which is we run Louisiana Power Coalition, they would have known. But whatever.
I have one speech that lasts for years, so, sorry.
All right, I have a couple of questions. My name's Robert Martin. I'm a owner on Black Bayou, and I actually took the time to read the bill, and very boring, but my first question is, who is the commission and who designates the board members?
Julie can answer this very well.
Basically, it stated that the commission was appointed and the board members were elected. It never said who the main person was who was going to appoint them. I mean, you don't just show up and you get appointed. Someone appoints you. So we've never gotten that answer.
So there's a lot of vague areas is what you're saying.
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
Because the bottom line is if you don't have a commission and you don't have identification of who's going to be on the board to make decisions about our property, what's going on?
Exactly. And one of the things you have to understand is y'all put yourself out there and pretend you're on the commission. Okay, I'm going to get you, Judy, I'm going to get you, Jason, I'm going to get y'all and put y'all on the commission because I want to be president of the board.
So are you saying the commission is basically the government?
No, it's a group of people who have ulterior motives.
And what might their motives be?
We don't know. We would like to know. So if you find out, please tell us.
Well, I would like to know who the people are, because when I read it, they talk about a commission and then they talk about a board, and I'm saying, who is the commission and who's going to appoint the board? You would think that they would give some kind of definition of what qualifies somebody to be on a board.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Martin, we agree with you. We really do. And if anybody can find that answer for us, we would be very happy. If you don't mind, we're going to go ahead and move along. We have a few more coming up. No.
Brenda O'Brock from Shreveport, Louisiana, with We the People of Northwest Louisiana and Louisiana Power Coalition. And my question is, what can we do to cut this dragon's head off? Are there any lawmakers, congressmen or whatever, who is proposing to take the money away from this Heritage Act or this heritage area so that they don't have funds to operate?
There have been a couple of efforts in that direction that have not been successful. One thing that happened this week, the House of Representatives, Congressman James Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin, they passed his bill the Property Rights Protection Act. And this does some of that. One of the things it does is it makes it so communities cannot put in rules and regulations that just take somebody's private property and using eminent domain and that sort of thing. The whole eminent domain thing really gained power in 2006 with the Kelo decision of the Supreme Court. The Kelo decision shocked America because up until then, everything that ever came out of the Supreme Court was protect property rights. Everything that came out of a founding father, everything was protect property rights. Here was a decision that came out that said, if a community can benefit better by taking this land over here, this private land, and converting it to another private entity and to get more tax dollars out of it or something like that, that's okay. As Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said in her opposition to this, she said, so if a community has a Motel 6 and they can make more tax dollars from a Ritz-Carlton, then that's okay. In other words, no private property was sacred anymore. They destroyed it. The Property Rights Protection Act was written to overturn the Kelo decision and all this use of eminent domain across the country. So it's a beginning to do that.
And I would like to say as well, for our group, Caddo Lake's Last Stand, moving forward, we know that this fight is not over, so we plan to further educate ourselves and work with you guys in both states to fight for legislation that will better protect us from things like this in the future. Go ahead, sir.
Denson DeRosa from Vivian, Louisiana. I was wanting to find out, you were speaking earlier of buffer zones, and I saw something in the script about tributaries of Caddo Lake being drawn into this. Like, now I'm not for certain if it is a direct tributary or draws into Caddo Lake, but like up above the area where I'm at, on 2 of those maps I'm in it, 2 of them I'm not. Okay, that's another one of those who, what, where, when things. But the next thing is you've got that as a possible tributary or link to Caddo Lake, and if the proposals as they're written is the way it's written, seems to me like then they're saying that that can be drawn into it as well, and that could fall into the buffer zone thing.
Absolutely. You've heard about the waters of the U.S. and this kind of thing. What they do with environmentalism is that they completely ignore government boundaries, which also includes your property rights, your property boundaries, and they make this big case that we have certain kinds of waterways, and we've got corridors, and we've got this and that, and nature moves in this direction. It doesn't care where the boundary of Louisiana and Texas is. It's where the migration goes and that sort of thing. The same thing is true with the waterways. You start out with a little mud puddle over here, and that moves in and crosses a little creek, and then it becomes a river, and then it becomes the Mississippi, and then it becomes the ocean. And that's how they view that. So everything, that means rainwater coming down. Now we've got to control that because that affects the riverways.
See, that's another thing that I was mentioning there was like if you, you have the quote 100-year flood, let's say, and you get this influx of water from somewhere else. Well, does that mean that if it flows across property that stays dry for the last 80 years, guess what?
They were declaring wetlands of things where they got rain once a year and there was a mud puddle once a year and it was a wetlands. And now, so you can't build there, you've got to preserve it, that's...
If we can float a toothpick, y'all.
For a minute.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'd say no, it's pretty empty out there. If you didn't get your question answered tonight, or you just didn't want to ask it at the microphone, we actually have a question box set up outside of this door. You're free to write your question down, drop it in the box, and we're going to go through and answer them to the best of our ability on the Facebook page that we have, Caddo Lake's Last Stand. You can also get more information at caddolakesLaststand.com. and we'll try to keep you guys up to date. I'm going to hand it over to Danny and let him close so that we can all wrap up tonight's meeting. You are, once again, welcome to go back to the gym if you'd like. We do still have a few tables set up there. And I'd just like to thank all of you for your time tonight and for standing with us. We're waiting on you, boss. I was just thanking everybody for their time. If you have anything that you'd like to close with.
I do. I'd just like to thank you for coming out, being engaged. You know, just take a couple of things away from here. When an environmentalist talks about saving something, ask them who they're saving it from. It may be you. I mean, just keep your eyes open, being vigilant. Just you pay attention. The duck blinds that they took out of Caddo Lake, they were called them unsustainable. Does that word mean more to you now than it did before? Those words mean something, so just keep up with them. Thank you. May God bless you, and have a good night.